everyone. It's good to see you all. Thank you for joining us today. This Mission Leaders group is really a great group, and I feel very fortunate to get to work with all of you now that I'm at LSA. I'd like to introduce you to Lem Cartman, who is doing a virtual internship this summer with Lutheran Services in America. He's a rising junior at Valparaiso University in Indiana, and he grew up in Chicago. He hopes to one day start a nonprofit to help provide health care to people in his community on the south side of Chicago. So Lem, I will turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start out by saying in the Hebrew scriptures, the prophet Micah, he gives us a very simple but challenging recipe for holiness. This is what Yahweh asks of you. Only this: act justly, love tenderly, and to walk humbly with your God. And this is the spirit I hope that we all bring to today's discussion of racism, racial justice. Like, my biggest motivation is to eradicate poverty, to empower poor individuals to become self-sufficient and advocating for positive change and justice for everyone. So, and sometimes that's hard. Like, sometimes it's really hard. It seems like I'm fighting an uphill battle. In an impoverished neighborhood, like on the south side of Chicago. And in this neighborhood, I've seen firsthand just how, lack of healthcare, poor education, unstable household, corruption issues, unjust authority figures, all this aid in keeping the disadvantaged at a disadvantage. And in these unprecedented times, man, it forces me just to take a step back and just reflect on my life and my faith and my morals. And most recently, the murder of George Floyd has sparked an outrage in my community. Outrage causing people to protest, riot, and loot. And as a young black male and an active member of my community, I share the same sentiment. When I first watched the video, I was down, depressed. And I struggled with being depressed and being angry. But now I feel empowered, I feel motivated. I feel like I need to become a better leader and I need to take a stand. And during this time, I've interacted with different members of my community. During a protest, I talked with a few elderly members of the Baptist church, and they was expressing their concerns about the risk of the black youth, and they spoke about an overall desperate need for change, and they were willing to sacrifice their lives for the future generations. And also another pastor at the protest, he was talking about systematic racism and how it affects the black collective, and how it makes it much more difficult for individuals from impoverished communities to have the opportunity to succeed. We're all out there standing against, fighting against a common enemy, a common cause, trying to fight the forces of hate that plague our society. The acts of police brutality are happening in conjunction with the pandemic. And if you look at the numbers, people of color are dying at a much higher rate than anyone else. And that's largely due to the lack of health care. And people of color make up majority of essential workers, yet they lose their job at a faster rate. So just imagine constantly working more, but achieving less. And as a nursing major, I tend to look at police brutality as a symptom of a deeper disease. And in order to treat a symptom, we have to treat the disease, which in this case, I think the disease is systematic racism along with a history of black oppression. And Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III says racism is a virus, that it infects the spirit, it infects the soul. And this virus disease has infected the soul of this country. It's right at the base of everyday life in the United States, and it's managed to persist over 400 years. LSA speaks to this issue by serving vulnerable populations, and many of whom are people of color with Christ-like intention. And as a faith-based organization, they recognize that we all have a moral obligation to stand in the name of justice and combat forces of hate. Because this is no longer just an issue of race, nor is it just an issue of police brutality. This is a moral issue, and when you break it down to the simplest form, this is simply right versus wrong. Right now I'm asking all of you to look into the interests of others, and that being the interests of the black community and their outcry for justice. So I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. Thank you for your time.
So I'd like to now turn it over to our convener, Kathy Benderschwick, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you today. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce my colleague, Bonnie Condon, which Bonnie continues to work to nurture and build our relationships with the faith communities in the areas we serve, not only the ELCA and UCC faith communities, but all the different faith communities in the areas that we serve. So now she is serving as VP of Faith Outreach and Community Health. So when Charlotte and Caitlin and I talked about who would be a good presenter for today, it was a no-brainer that Bonnie would be a great person to do this. Without further ado, Bonnie, I'll turn it over to you.
One of the nice things at Advocate Aurora, as Kathy said, is our faith-basedness. And so what that has enabled us to do is that a lot of our work is driven out of those faith-based roots and out of sort of justice and moral convictions. And so it really is a pleasure to be able to present this today to you all. Within Advocate Aurora, about 2.5 years ago, we decided that we wanted a comprehensive community-facing strategy that would really inform all of our community-facing work, whether that work was community health or faith outreach, whether that work was related to community relationships or sponsorship dollars that we provide to the community. And so what we did was one of my colleagues and I, Mark, co-led a large interdisciplinary team to look at sort of the latest cutting edge public health and hospital system literature about health. We also looked at our community health needs assessments for our 27 hospitals to identify common needs. And as we looked at those needs, we didn't want to just look at disease processes. We wanted to look at what are the underlying causes of those processes. This community strategy vision that you can obviously read for yourselves, but as you read it, I think the first 4 or 5 words are most important. We will build health equity. And to do that, we need to look at many things. Obviously, part of that is access to care, and it's improving outcomes. But a lot of it is done by addressing medical needs, but through a lens of social determinants of health. Let's begin to look at those underlying causes and really seriously begin to address them. And some of those causes are definitely rooted in justice and systems and systemic racism. Sort of the 6 areas that we thought could most impact health: housing, access to behavioral health, access to primary care, community safety, workforce development, and food security are some of the 6 most important drivers of health in our community. So one of the things we noticed was that there's a disproportionate burden caused by these factors and others on communities of color, and particularly upon African American communities. And so we want to focus our work in that way. One of the other things we did was we tried to see what would be, in addition to focusing in those 6 areas, what are some other things that we can do? And so we determined that some major initiatives that we were going to need to do to kind of get things going was that we want to screen 100% of our patients for social determinants. So we want to understand their risk factors for food and housing and their community safety. And so decided that we are going to make a bold step of investment in our communities beyond what we already do of time and dollars, but we are going to we are in the midst of developing an investment strategy where we will fund projects around housing, around food security, not small projects, but actually big dollars, up to $50 million over a 5-year period. But we will be funding things in communities that have lower incomes and higher unemployment rates that create some of those differences in life expectancy. And then we also want to do a better job of how we use our money in the community around donations. So we're not going to be sponsoring so many golf outings, but rather looking at where we can give our money directly to create change in the community. So if we really want to make a big impact, we will be partnering with faith communities and community-based organizations and health departments and other providers, because when we all come to bear on a problem and work together and advocate for policy change and invest in communities, that's when the change will happen, not when one organization tries to do something by themselves. Choose your key partners that are focusing on the one or two important things that you want to do in your community, because that collective impact really can make a difference. Is we looked at our COVID data within our health system, and we looked at the public COVID data about where the largest number of cases were happening. And by and large, those cases were happening in communities of color, communities that were primarily African American or a mixture of African American and Latinx. And so one of the things we decided to pilot was a micro-mobile testing, where we actually have mobile vans that are now going out into the community. And we are targeting some Southside communities that are primarily African American. And then within some of the other parts of the city on the north side and in the northern suburbs where we serve, we are serving communities that are primarily communities of color, but we are going into the communities and partnering with churches and other community-based organizations so that we are literally bringing the testing to the community. We continue to focus on community safety. That's a big piece within Advocate Aurora, especially around street violence. We have a major trauma recovery center at Christ Hospital, and that work continues, as well as work that we have around sexual assault. And actually, Kathy is very involved in that work, and those are our two main focus areas there. And finally, one of the biggest and most growing issues that we're seeing in terms of need right now and hearing from the community is around food. We know that as really right as COVID was kicking in, we were reaching out to our normal partners, including the Chicago Food Depository and the Northern Illinois Food Bank. And we actually have some pop-up food pantries in some of our hospitals, but we were looking at where does the food need to be, how do we get the food, and how do we partner with people in the community to make sure food gets out. And so there are various ways we've been distributing food, including fresh produce, both at our hospitals, but especially with partners in the community to make sure that members in the community that are in need will be able to connect to food. That there are lots of things you can do. And I think the first thing that I would advise for your organization is to really think through what you do and where you fit within community. What are the justice issues that are particularly important to your organization and to your constituency? And then sort of focus on that. I would advise you not to be afraid of thinking, well, we don't have that many dollars that we could give. It wasn't that Advocate Aurora came in and said, here's a bucket of money, somebody figure it out. But it came to be about 6 different partners, each of whom brought something. Some no money, but thought leadership. Some brought the ability to give space. Others brought the ability to prepare food. And so if you think about how you can work with others to solve a community problem or address some of the injustice that you might see in your community, don't be afraid to step in there. And I really encourage you to think about who those key partners would be. But remember your faith-based teachings. In general, you will be focusing on principles together and values that you will find many other organizations share. Maybe your public health department, or maybe another provider that provides the same kinds of care you do. We are competitors sometimes, but we also often share the same passion and values and could make a big difference together.
Thank you, Bonnie and Kathy. We appreciate both of you sharing with us today. So we are going to break into discussion rooms for just a few minutes. We'll be reconvening at 4:50 so that we can share what was discussed in those breakout rooms. We could very quickly just share a little bit about what we discussed. I can start by saying that the breakout room that I was in discussed how many of them serve in communities that are largely white communities, but they've seen a real difference lately in community engagement and how their communities are, protesting peacefully and really pushing for racial equity, and how that gives us hope, and we're heartened to see that. So that was good to hear from our group.
we discussed two different things, really. One, the importance of establishing partnerships with people and other organizations outside of crises times, just because then those become so important when the crisis does happen. And how we have seen those relationships and collaborations evolve even more during the past few weeks. And then the importance of mental health training and support for everybody concerned, for employees of our organizations and the residents that we care for, if it's a residential based organization. But we discussed those two different topics.
We discussed, based on Lem's reflection, the need to look in the mirror and look at our own organizations, particularly as we look to moving up the leadership channel. We also talked about some of the terrific partnership ideas that Bonnie put on the table that people hadn't thought of, so thank you.
Yeah, we also said that we appreciated the concept of doing work in partnerships for collective impact, that made a lot of sense, particularly for an organization like mine, which is smaller, to work with other organizations to make a difference, even if it's simply to be a convener, but across the board.
Great, thank you everyone. Even in a short time, it sounded like we had some excellent discussions, and I look forward to continuing these types of good discussions with all of you going forward.
Just wanted to thank everybody once again for participating today. I know this went very, very quickly. Lem, thank you for joining us today. And Bonnie, thank you for the presentation that you did as well.
So I'll leave you with a quote from Maya Angelou that I found particularly appropriate for our context, in which feels like we're facing so many hurdles between the persistent systems of inequity and the pervasive coronavirus. Love recognizes no barriers. It jumps hurdles, leaps fences, penetrates walls to arrive at its destination of full hope. And you all certainly give me hope. So thank you, and we will see you in September and hopefully talk to you before then. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.